This is Pod Populi, podcast for the people.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice or be a substitute for therapy. Please contact a mental health professional as needed. If you are in need of urgent or emergency health care, please contact your medical and or mental health provider, call 911, or go to your nearest emergency room. The information presented in this podcast does not reflect the opinions of those with whom Dr. Ellick might be affiliated as an employee, consultant, or colleague, past or present. Hello, and welcome to another episode of From Mayhem to Mindset with Dr. Laura. I am your host, Dr. Laura Ellick, and my guest today really needs no introduction, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to introduce him anyway. This is Paul Sheesley. Hello, Paul.
Hi.
It's nice to see you again.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Try not to blush, but Paul Sheesley is the founder of EPC Leadership, where psychology meets performance to help ambitious leaders and organizations unlock their highest potential. Paul specializes in schema-informed coaching, leveraging evidence-based psychology to create profound and measurable transformations, both personally and professionally. Known for his candid yet compassionate style, Paul has successfully coached CEOs, senior executives, and high net worth professionals across industries, guiding them from self-awareness to strategic action. Whether he's decoding leadership dynamics, improving emotional intelligence, or tackling mindset barriers, Paul's mission remains clear: helping high achievers lead effectively without sacrificing their mental health, values, or authenticity. Join us, please, as Paul shares his unique approach to high-performance leadership, psychology-driven coaching, and his commitment to cultivating leaders who thrive both in the boardroom and beyond. Whew, I am speechless on that. So
that's a mouthful.
That is a mouthful, but I'm so glad to have you here. We started a conversation several weeks ago when you were on the other podcast, I Wish I Had the Balls with Mark Cantor, and we got into a little bit of the work that you do. And I'm so grateful that you took time out of your schedule to join me today. So, I was just really intrigued by this combination between psychotherapy and coaching, because coaching is the buzzword, right? Mm-hmm. So how did you come to deciding that coaching would be a good fit for you? And how did you even know that what you were looking for was coaching?
Yeah, that's a great question, because really looking at the last 2 decades, the first 10 really immersed in the psychological work, right? So clinical settings, anxiety, trauma, personality disorders. But really over time, as the population changed, the folks that I was working with, there was like a common theme. And so the theme being that many of my clients now were high acuity individuals, executives, leaders, and they would initially come to me for mental health, right? So psychological workings. And the cool thing is that after working with folks for so long, they would start to feel better emotionally, right? Which is the goal. But then it became more of like guiding that change and channeling that newfound clarity or energy really into their professional lives. And so there would be this shift in the room working with clients from the psychological piece or psychopathology piece to more coaching, because what they had originally come for was quite resolved, right? And so we had this relationship. We're working together, and we're starting to use this momentum in the workforce, in the workplace.
You made a really, really good point, and I want to highlight this because this is one of the difficulties I'm seeing with the coaching industry. You mentioned that you started off from a clinical perspective, seeing people with psychopathology, right? And then you switched into helping people with executive athlete performance, all of the other things. What I'm finding is coaches are jumping in. They don't have clinical training. They're finding that someone does have some psychopathology, whether it's depression, anxiety, low-level kind of stuff, versus the more personality disorder things, and then they're stuck and they don't have any capacity to deal with this. So, what are your thoughts about that? Because anyone can call themselves a coach. And I've had several people come to me after seeing coaches, and I'm like, ooh, you probably should have come to me like a while ago, but I'm glad you're here now.
Yeah. Oh, I could talk a lot about this in that. So two thoughts, right? So first, to just start with the fact that really poised me to be, I think, a great coach is that I'm able to work in parallel. And I bring that asset to the clients that I work with. And it's an educational process as well. It's talking and being direct and transparent with what we're doing. And that's so important too, is because when people come to coaching or they come to therapy, they have goals. They want to know what we're going to do, how we're going to do it over what period of time. But I'm clear, that therapy, this psychological treatment, it really addresses some of these deeper things, right? Like emotional pain or psychological symptoms or unresolved issues from the past. So one way of looking at it from my perspective is that there's an emphasis on history, and there's a storytelling process that's a part of that. Because it really should be about healing, right? And understanding. And I think that's important. Now, coaching, to put that also more simplistically as well, is that I think that's more like future oriented, where folks typically have the resources, like they're focusing on clarity or achieving goals, they're enhancing strength. So it's more structured around like measurable outcomes, I think, within like a set time frame. And time frame is also another facet to the decision. And I will say, as you probably know, I love research and I love measurable outcomes. And research does show that while psychotherapy is effective for symptom reduction, right? Coaching demonstrates effectiveness in goal attainment, right? The career advancement. And so these words are cues to guiding the client into which direction we really need to head into, and at what point do they merge together.
So I think that's a really great description. And one of the things that I'm seeing, which I'm very protective of the field of psychology, psychotherapy, like we did the work, we went to school, we did the training. And I'm curious your opinion on this, that I see coaches, and I'm probably putting you on the spot, but I see coaches who are talking about, well, I use cognitive behavioral techniques and I use DBT techniques and I use motivational interviewing. And I really take issue with that because yes, anybody can pick up a CBT book, can pull out an exercise and give it to someone. But unless you know what you're dealing with underneath, right? You could be opening up Pandora's box, right?
Absolutely. I think standing out means like really demonstrating evidence-based methods. I will say that over and over again. I think there's also an important on corporate fluency, which I think a lot of coaches have that because many coaches have come from a corporate background. I recently had taken some coursework at Harvard, and it was a mastery coaching session. And I probably 35% of the participants worked for big law, and they had transitioned to coaching. And then obviously psychological depth. And what comes to mind specifically with that is even like some of the assessments that coaches use are heavily rooted in psychological basis. And so, coaches are giving these assessments and depending on their familiarity, like the 360 or the strength-based assessment. But if we start getting into, I think, more personality assessments, I think that's where the waters become murky because a lot of coaches have not had formal training in like the MMPI, for example. And so I think it's everybody's responsibility to be able to map out what they're comfortable with, what they're capable of doing. And I think that if we really consider those concepts about our strengths and our training, I think we'll all steer in the right direction. it's when we start to take the risks, we're putting the person that we're working with at risk. And so that's a responsibility that I think that coaches and therapists need to consider at all times.
Yeah. So ultimately, we're really trying to help our client, and we have to be aware of what are the techniques that we're using and what we could potentially be unraveling if we're not using it appropriately. Now, I've heard all different kinds of things about how to become a coach. People will just, hey, I'm a coach now. Welcome, I'm a coach. But
Yeah.
to really go ahead and do it right, what would
Sure.
you recommend? I know ICF, there's some of the other, really good certifications. What process did you go through, or what would you recommend for someone?
You make a really good point about the training. For a psychologist, therapist, counselor, there's a track, right? There's a specified track, and that track seems quite consistent, right? You get into the certain programs, and these are the credentials, and this is what you have to do for licensure, and these are the hours of supervision, and so on. Coaching seems to be a bit more a la carte, if you will. There's a lot of reputable organizations like the ICF, which I do recommend. I mean, we want to associate with these bodies of education and advancement, especially when it comes to coaching, because we if we're going to call ourselves a coach, that's just the name. We need to be able to own, like, what does that mean? Just like, what is this being a psychologist? We identify as a psychologist, so what kind of psychologist? What is it, our specialty? And I remember I had read, like, the ICF had done a study back in like 23, 24, where they had actually marked like a 54% jump in coaching practitioners. It's like 110,000 or something. And there are so many programs out there that you can join and say, I'm a life coach, a health coach, just a coach, an executive coach. But I think if you use those identifiers, I think you really have to follow up and show, I have this training. I've done supervision, which is really important on both sides. Again, I mentioned like the Harvard program that I've attended coursework there, and it's so helpful in the coaching world. And so affiliating with institutes and organizations that have facilitators who really understand and have the research and have the background, I think that's the direction that coaches need to consider.
So much like therapy, it really is about, you have to know what you don't know and be willing to go find out what you don't know. Like, there's no arrogance here. We all are lacking a knowledge base in something. So go ahead and get it, and get supervision. Every coach that I know who is a reputable coach has a coach themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Or therapist.
And much like a supervision kind of thing. And, the thing that I'm impressed by, and for people who are going to listen and see this podcast, I really want to highlight the fact that you are all about the evidence-based practice and all about the numbers. So talk data to me, baby, because I love it. Because nobody talks about the data. And the data is really what forms the basis of our interventions. Like, why are we doing this intervention? How do we know that CBT works for this? Why do we choose DBT for this? So it sounds like you are up on all of the data. This is the nerd in me, the data nerd coming out.
Yeah.
Where are your best sources of data? Where do you get it from?
So, I mean, like the Harvard Review, I get just different institutions, MIT, they come out with some great stuff. And I incorporate it in a lot of my blog writing. It is saturated in data. But now the interesting thing, and I say this, and I think I go back and forth, is it's looking at coaching data I think it's hard to really capture. And just like I think some psychological data, especially within the office, can be hard to capture because there's a lot of subjectivity to it. I mean, that's, in the beginning, if you have concrete goals, it's like, oh, how are we measuring these goals? Are we using reassessing, using the same assessment? In the coaching world, we can use stakeholder information based on like their observations and their assessments on the individual. And, much like in therapy, it's like, well, how do we know? And the feedback is actually going to be coming from the client. It's like, I know because this is what's changed. This is what I've been able to accomplish. I did get the promotion. The stakeholders saying that my leadership skills, my ability to communicate, remain assertive, or my ability to negotiate and manage my anxiety is visible. I feel it internally, and externally, there's a demonstration of what concepts we're working on. So I think when the tire meets the road, it's what is the subjective feedback? But there are lots of studies that they correlate the return on an investment and what percentages and so forth. And that's great to put in a slideshow for like stakeholder agreement, but everybody's different. But what we can say is, look, we have these certain approaches and these personality improvements that have been shown as qualities in leaders, and this is the strategy that we're going to use to work on those concepts, like agreeableness, for example. How are we working with that, right? How are we working with someone's ability to form relationships, right? And so again, it does come back to subjectivity.
So what is your favorite coaching environment? Do you like working for corporations? Do you like working for athletes? What's the group that really gets you going?
Yeah. So for me, the corporation has a name, right? So I'm not, that's not something that concerns me is the name. It's who's in the building, right? Who am I working with? And I'm an attachment therapist, I guess by nature. And so, always looking at the correlation in relationships. And so talking to the stakeholder, talking to the client or the direct reports. I do, the one-on-one coaching. I really like social theory and groups and group leadership. And how to emphasize like prototypical groups within a workforce, and how to use emotion-driven, I guess considerations, and like how to motivate, how to make decisive decisions, how groups do that, how leaders do that. So really, wherever relationships exist, I get excited, and I really, and then I love helping that make sense to the other person of like, wow, whatever you're struggling with internally also can be seen externally, but we got to work internally, right? And we'll also grow in understanding how that external factor is important to you and your organization. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. I mean, do you make homework? Everybody has to watch the movie 12 Angry Men about decision making, and because that's a perfect example of how, decision making can occur, and persuasion, and you can have one person who eventually changes the way the entire crowd makes the decision.
Yeah. So there's a lot of checkpoints. I think that's important because most folks who show up asking for help, if we let them do it their way, they're gonna be spinning their wheels, or they're gonna have the same outcome. So I'll often, as an accountability, right? Coaches and therapists are accountability partners, and so during those accountability sessions, at some point, there has to be a checkpoint, and there has to be conversations about, really clear conversations about why are we not meeting this checkpoint? What's the feedback? Is it something that is going on between me and that person, whether it's the goals too vague or not, or it's too specific? Is there environmental factors that are at play? Because that also is a part of the algorithm of the work. So I really emphasize the checkpoints.
The work that I've done in this area happens to involve family businesses. I mean, if you want to talk about looking at dynamics and attachment theory, have a business that is run by a family and look at the entire thing start to fall apart because brother and sister don't get along, or father favors one, or who is taking over the business. So is that something that you work on as well?
Gosh, I don't know if there's some sort of reading between the lines in my and how I present myself, because for whatever reason, I tend to get quite a bit of family-run businesses, and it's such a unique dynamic. It's mom and dad, brother and sister, and there's just and they work for the company, and then so it's being able. So this is where I think the psychological and the coaching piece comes into play. And very clear boundaries are being set, because sometimes I'm doing family counseling, like family therapy about relationships, things that have happened internally in the family decades ago that's showing up in the workplace, and helping them to see the overlap is really important, because it doesn't say, oh, we're at work now, let me put those feelings aside, right? And then sometimes it's coaching, right? It's one of the siblings just simply doesn't have the experience for that promotion, and now dad, but also CEO, is telling this person, you're not ready. And then there's a blending of these emotions that.
Ouch. That's an ouch. We're kicking you out. We love you, but
we love you. Oh, yeah, but sorry. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm helping people have these conversations, and helping people to process really simultaneously the emotional upheaval that they're having internally, and the professional trying to understand it professionally. And that's really hard. It is so hard. But yeah,
it's definitely challenging work. And there's one challenge that we haven't gotten to, and I'm going to ask you a question about that after we take a quick break. Okay, so we're back talking with Paul Sheesley. And so here is a question that I have. People seem to have a negative connotation when you say that you work with high net worth individuals, executives, athletes. I get that in the work that I do, especially in the addiction area, where people say, oh, what kind of problems could these people have? So answer that from your perspective.
And I get that a lot too. And I have made a comment that, in part, the question of like, how did I get into coaching and working with these particular populations, is that I think they have that stigma, like you just said, is that, like, what problems could you have? Like, so I work with folks who like win the lottery, right? There's wealth psychologists that do that, and I've had that type of work in my office as well. And it's like, well, that makes you think. It's like, so money makes you happy, and that's not the truth, because these folks have come into a resource by luck, right? They played the lottery, and now they have substantial amount of money, but their problems didn't just disintegrate. And so, with success, problems don't go away because we have a niche or a success, and whether we play basketball or we're a CEO of a company. Anxiety, stress, burnout. We have relationships, we have family problems. And so that's a lot of the overlap too in working with folks, is that, just not working with like money problems or wealth problems, working with relationship issues. We're working with concepts that everybody share: stress, again, anxiety and depression and substance use, alcoholism. Does not discriminate because you're in a different tax bracket, or because you came from this family or went to this school. And so I welcome that conversation anytime somebody brings it up or asks the question, because again, it's an educational piece. And more often than not, people, I think, can empathize, or they're able to see a different perspective, because there is another one to be had.
I think that's a great point. Nobody can control who gets bipolar disorder or not. It does not discriminate. However, I do find that more money, more problems in a lot of ways too. More money can exacerbate the family situation that is already there, right? If you have a brother who is a lazy ne'er-do-well, thinking that he's going to inherit all of this money may actually make it worse.
Yes.
Also, I think one of the things that people forget is that all problems are relative. right? So if you're homeless, your problems may center around not having a place to live, right? And taking care of the very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, right? Just safety and security.
Right.
But for people who have more money, now we have a whole different host of problems, including, okay, I need help. And I can't go just anywhere because I have paparazzi watching where I go. And I don't have the same level of privacy as other people do. I also have to worry that because people know that I'm a person of means, they're going to take advantage of that and try to say that I need to be in treatment longer than I really do. They're going to jack up the prices. They're going to overcharge. Any number of things that I can think of, and they may not take my problems seriously. And so you really have to have a professional who gets that whoever you are, your problems are relative to the stature you have in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll second the exacerbation of the issue. And it sounds like we share a lot of this, overlap in the situations with some of these families. I mean, there's working with development in young adults, right? So I work in family therapy. I've worked with adolescents and young adults, and, whether their parents are rich, they still have to go through a developmental process as well. And money can exacerbate that, especially if there's some entitlement, like, oh, hey, dad, throw me a cool mill, right? That's a quote. And they're serious, but that's not the reality, but that's their reality of entitlement. And so, there is a difference between entitlement and privilege, which might be a whole nother episode. And absolutely. So you're absolutely right. People, I think, specifically those, depending on where they are positioned, have that extra anxiety or have to scrutinize who they come to help with because their board is watching. The managers, they're observing and watching. It's like, hey, I need to take off once a week. Well, why? And that question does get asked. And so people often think, well, it's none of your business. That's a hard to avoid that question sometimes in the workplace. And so people, they do. It's hard to find, I think, for folks, people assume it's so easy just to pick up the phone and call someone. But for certain populations, it's really not that easy. They've got to, be careful as well and pick the right people. And
those are situations where I've actually done home visits, where if I ever told in my graduate studies any of my supervisors that I was going to do home visits, can you imagine? I went to a program that was like, you're a blank slate and now you're going and you're doing a home visit. So, but I think, again, that's understanding the unique dynamic that this particular client is presenting to you and really meeting them where they're at. And if you're committed to someone, doing the work and getting the work done. The other thing I often think about is, okay, everybody is saying that anxiety is our biggest problem right now in our culture. And I'm going to counter that. And we talked a little bit about this, is I think we're all anxious because our work-life balance is skewed. And if you're talking with a high net worth individual or an athlete who travels all the time, maybe the wife is fed up and they're getting divorced, or the husband is fed up and getting divorced. Let's make it equal opportunity here. Then there may be a tendency to overcompensate with the kids, like, hey, let me buy you that car.
Sure.
Right. Or let me send you to the best schools so I can feel less guilty. But the issue is really, I don't have the time. I have to be everything to everyone. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, with social media, work-life balance is like the buzzword, right? But I'm like, oh, well, I've been doing that even before it was a concrete understanding generally. And then there's like work-life integration, right? And so that's more of the, well, how do we integrate our work and life and hobbies and fun and all that stuff? And that in itself is a challenge, and it's not a short-lived goal, because sometimes it takes up to 6 months it's almost like a translucent knot. It's like we pull here and we pull there, and we gotta, it's not getting to the point where we want it to be. And a lot of times there's lifestyle changes. But you're absolutely right. Sometimes that integration isn't perceived as an option, whether you're an entrepreneur, which I think people give me crap about sometimes. I'm like, if you're an entrepreneur and depending on what industry you're in, there is no integration. If your goal is to have a successful business, there's going to be sacrifices, and there may be consequences, repercussions from that, familial, relationally, economically. And so I see that all the time, startups working 110 hours, doing couples therapy, sell the business or I'm leaving. These are some tough decisions. Or athletes who are traveling, or sports managers who live half the year in one place and the other half in the other. And so rigorous travel schedules. So absolutely, it is really it's unique to everybody what that integration looks like. And, another concept I'll often bring in, even something through my lived experience, that my biggest role model is my 7-year-old daughter. Because seeing smiles on her face and having fun and just really enjoying life as a reminder that spontaneity and fun, that is a core need. That's not an optional need that drops off when you're 18, but something that is really a part of our healthy developmental process. And so just because we're 18 and have a business or college or whatever, we still have to be able to find that balance or to integrate that into our lives so that we can prevent burnout, that we can manage what's important to us in our lives. And sometimes those lines become really blurred, and what might be okay is not okay. And being able to see that, I think, can often require professional help and helping them to then reestablish, well, wow, I really need to kind of take a step back with this person I'm working with, a coach or therapist, and understand, like, how did I get here, and how's this not working for me, and what is my strategy to find that integration.
Would you consider yourself an entrepreneur?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think anybody who goes out on their own as a coach or a therapist, psychologist, whatever, I think we're all entrepreneurs, and I think we're not trained for that. I think we're trained to get out of school, and it's all going to be fine. And I'm doing a podcast on that later on this week to talk about that piece. But with the work-life balance thing, you sort of like led right into the question. So what do you do for fun?
Yeah. Had this conversation about over the weekend. So I was working on my boat all this weekend, and one of the takeaways is I didn't look at my phone, and I didn't notice it until I was actually talking to this person. I was like, you know what? I realized I didn't pick up my phone, and it felt really good. It's such a habit to just pick it up, even if you don't have a notification. Just make sure there isn't a notification. Just to stay on top of something, to be reminded of something that's lingering overhead, maybe for Monday. But it was so nice to be able to set that aside and really forget about it, and just to busy my mind doing something, because I do like working with my hands, and it's a hobby. I think some people would also say it's a lifestyle, because it is. And so that's just one thing that I made a choice and a decision to enter into my life, because I knew that I had to commit. And sometimes that's really hard to commit to, like going to the gym. I have a personal trainer. There's a more of a commitment there. And I think he's also a bit of my therapist too. So
is my trainer for sure.
Yeah,
and it goes vice versa. So, cause we're always talking back and forth. So
yes. So those are just some recent things that have entered into my life with purpose. And I have to consciously keep them in my life. And that means often sacrificing other things, because without them, the quality of my life can dissipate.
It's interesting because everybody knows if they reach out to me after 8:30 at night, the chances of reaching me are slim to none. I'll see the text, but I'm not getting to it until tomorrow. Like that's always
great.
been what I call my quiet time to
Yes.
do whatever it is that I want to do, which is could be nothing, could be scrolling on TikTok, could be anything, but I have to turn off my brain. And one of the things I want your opinion on this is I am very disappointed by how the culture has rebounded from COVID, because at the time during COVID, we became very focused on our health. Don't come into work if you're sick. Have that work-life balance. And then I've noticed we are actually back to the same and worse, because now that more people work remotely, now the expectation is, well, I'm sending you a text or an email at 9:00 at night. And if you don't respond by tomorrow morning, I'm following up being like, did you get it?
Yes.
So the level of pressure, and we're just talking about work-life balance, I don't think there is any. And I think COVID destroyed that.
Yeah, I think so. The folks that I work with, especially with the remote positions that are now available, you're right. They're checking emails at 10, 11. They have 2 a.m., especially if their counter organization is in Europe or Australia. And so the time is, and that's a whole nother knot to untangle as well. And even recently, I see this a lot, especially around holidays, is that there's this guilt or this spike in anxiety when folks return from a holiday because they took time off. And now I'm also seeing this resurgence in the lack of like the mental health days, right? Just taking time for yourself. People think that we can just chunk time off. Like seems like everybody went to Europe this year. I'm like, great. What's going to be different when you get back? I mean, what are you talking about? I'm like, so we can't go back into the same stressed out. It's like you held your breath. Now I can finally breathe because I'm taking a 2-week trip. And now I'm coming back and going to jump headfirst back into the same routine. That's not sustainable. That's not what breaks burnout. And so, again, just help educating people and encouraging people to find that balance, and just even being an observer, right? It's like, you notice when you got back from your holiday that you are like underwater. Like what's going on? Like, how do you explain that?
Absolutely.
Oh my gosh, all my emails. I came back to 500 emails and I've got all this to do. And I'm like, yeah, so what are we going to do about that, right? So absolutely, I see it as well.
That's a big one. And just, okay, I'm not a germ phobic, but I just have to say, nobody covers their mouth when they cough anymore. Like, what happened to that? Right? Like everything went back as if we haven't experienced anything, which I find, if you're a behavior scientist and you're looking at all of this, this is like, wow, what is this, regression to the mean? Like, what is going on that we had such an experience that could have been life-changing for everybody's perspective, and we just kind of regressed right back to where we were. I'm having elbow surgery at the end of the month, and I'm looking forward to the 3 days that I'm going to be off, because those are days where I know I'm supposed to be off. My anxiety about it is already high. And I can imagine that I'm probably going to be like sneaking in, checking some emails and trying to stay on top of things. So I guess that means I need a coach, right? Is that kind of like what we're looking at here? Right? I need some guidance. So
yeah. No, yeah. I mean, I have the same. If I go away, it tends to be right at the last day, when the reality of me coming back,
re-entry syndrome.
What am I coming back to? I just got off of this interstate and now I got to get back on, and there's a lot of anxiety there. So what do is I have to be aware of it. I have to call it out. And I have to be honest with myself and saying, I know what this is about, right? These are my unrelenting standards. This is my perfectionism showing up. This is my people pleasing being triggered. And so I have to do some self-work, and it helps. Does it go away in total? No, it doesn't. It's still there, but it's I'm managing it. And then my re-entry isn't this panic, because being panicked, I'm not a critical thinker. I'm not, smart. I have to I re-enter, and I have a process for that. So everybody, I think we can tailor a process to re-entry, especially when we take time off or preparing to take time off.
That is a great takeaway point. I'm going to develop a re-entry plan. I think that's awesome.
There we go.
So Paul Sheesley, it's been amazing speaking with you. Tell everybody how they can reach you for coaching, for psychotherapy. Are you taking on new clients?
Yes, I am. Be happy to have a discovery call. You can find me at EPCleadership.com. And then you can always find me on my clinical site, which is paulsheesley.lcpc.com.
And you keep those two separate, right?
I do. Yes.
Love that.
Absolutely.
Love that.
Yeah.
Because you're keeping the boundaries. Like
Keeping
this
the
is
boundaries.
for the therapy piece. This is for the coaching piece. Fantastic. It was so nice having a conversation with you. I love that we got into some of the nitty gritty kind of stuff. Really, really important stuff. Thanks, Paul, for spending some time with me today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on From Mayhem to Mindset. If you found today's episode helpful, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave a 5-star review. It really helps spread the message. Want to dive deeper? Check out my book, Wisdom from the Universe, available now on Amazon. And if you're looking for a speaker to inspire and transform, I'd love to connect. Visit www.lauraellick.com to learn more. Remember, you don't have to just survive, you can thrive. See you next time.